The lesson topic for this video is, I can find 6 trig ratios using a point. So, yes, I did say 6 trig ratios. There are actually 6 trig ratios, even though we have always known only 3 of them. Okay, we've known sine, cosine, and tangent, both in geometry and in algebra 2. But now there are 3 additional trig ratios. There are cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Now, each of these 3 new trig ratios is the reciprocal of one of our old trig ratios that we already knew. So let's start by writing out what our trig ratios are for sine, cosine, and tangent. So sine, you should remember, is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. And the tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. So, if I said that the other 3 trig ratios are reciprocals of the ones that we've already talked about, we just have to make sure we're matching up with the correct one, and then we can just use the reciprocal of the fraction, and that would be the new trig ratio. So, sine and cosecant are reciprocals of each other. Cosecant is abbreviated with CSC for cosecant, and therefore cosecant of theta is hypotenuse over opposite. The cosine and secant are reciprocals of each other. Secant is abbreviated SEC for secant. So the secant ratio is hypotenuse over adjacent. And lastly, cotangent and tangent are reciprocals of each other. Now these 2 are pretty obvious because tangent and cotangent kind of makes a lot of sense there, right? And so if we take the reciprocal of tangent, so adjacent over opposite, we have cotangent, the cotangent ratio, which is COT. Now, the thing that is actually a little tricky here is that you might think that cosine, C-O-S, cosine, and cosecant would go together, and they don't. They are not reciprocals of each other. And that's, I guess, just a way you could remember it is that the 2 that you'd think would go together, cosine and cosecant, don't. Tangent and cotangent do, cosine and cosecant don't. So then maybe it would remember that sine goes with cosecant and cosine goes with secant. Okay, so in this diagram here, all we are going to do is write the 6 trig ratios or trigonometric ratios for theta. So here is our angle theta. Before we get started listing all the trig ratios, we should for sure label our sides. So remember that across from the right angle is the hypotenuse. So I'll label that HYP. And opposite of the angle that we're talking about, so if this is the angle we're talking about, opposite, the opposite side is the side with 8 here, so that's opposite. And that leaves the third side to be the adjacent side. All right, so let's list our 6 trig ratios. We have sine, cosine, tangent, cosecant, secant, and cotangent. Sorry about that, and cotangent. So if I want to take the sine of theta, I know the sine of theta is the opposite over the hypotenuse, so 8 over 17. The opposite side over the hypotenuse. Now, if we wanted to jump right down and do the reciprocal trig ratio, the reciprocal of sine is cosecant. So if we wanted to write the cosecant ratio, we could simply take the 17 and the 8 and switch their places for the reciprocal. All right, jumping back up to cosine, cosine of theta. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so the adjacent side is 15, the hypotenuse is 17. Which trig ratio is the reciprocal of cosine? Well, secant. So we know that secant theta is going to be 17 over 15. And then lastly, we have the tangent. Tangent of theta is the opposite side over the adjacent, and that's 8 over 15. And therefore, the cotangent for theta is the reciprocal of 8 over 15, which is 15 over 8. Again, these are our original 3 sine, cosine, and tangent ratios, and the 3 new ones are the reciprocals of those. Sine, the reciprocal is cosecant; cosine, the reciprocal is secant; and tangent, the reciprocal is cotangent.